what do you guys think? Ancient Mayan temple off the beaten path?
I want to go.
Welcome back. Today I'll be trying to explain the 2008 horror movie The Ruins to the best of my abilities, but more importantly try to shed a little bit more light behind the true horror of the temple, and the carnivoristic plants. So let's begin, with a short recap of the plot. The Ruins stars Jenna Malone as Amy, Laura Ramsey as Stacy, Jonathan Tucker as Jeff, and Sean Ashmore as Eric. The story is about a group of friends looking for fun during a sunny holiday in Mexico, but as they explore they find much more than what they bargained for. When they visit an archaeological temple, soon after the group find themselves fighting for survival from something evil that lives among the ruins. The ancient evil takes the shape of man-eating carnivorous vines. These plants wait for their victims to come close to the temple before it begins its horrifying ensnarement. Before I begin my explanation of the ruins and the plants behind the horror that drives this show, I want to first address how I feel about this show. This show is hard to rate because of the plot being so unique. I really did like the premise of the show, though I wish they could put more emphasis on the evil that drives these plants, and how the ancient people dealt with them. But when it comes to the plants as being the antagonist of the movie, I find it enthralling. But even though the movie has a perfect premise, I'm sorry to say the movie has another side to it, and that side I have to say is repulsive. This is because of the shallow character dynamics. Young adults that are stereotypical and cookie-cutter is the only downside to this movie. I want to make it clear I don't want to be too hard on these characters, because they do establish the seriousness of the situation. As a group they emulate and embody the self-centered disconnect, as they show a serious lack of understanding of the ancient culture that they're supposed to be visiting. It's their callous attitude that sets their movement for how they got into their bad predicament. To me that's a good part of the movie. Now to move on to the part of the video where I'll explain to the best of my understanding what the carnivoristic plants are. But to do this we must take into account every clue that was shown to us the very moment this sadly misguided group faced when they trespassed on forbidden temple grounds. First thing we notice is the temple is completely walled off from the rest of the forest by a field of white salt that encircles the temple, giving the temple a more forbidden appearance. What the uninformed vacationers failed to realize is that once they enter the salt field they were in no man's land. The definition of no man's land is an unoccupied area between opposing armies. And it's sad because that's exactly where they were. Death behind them, and potential death in front of them. Judging by the fact that the locals were somewhat cordial to the vacationers considering the potential global disaster on a worldwide economic and environmental scale, and to watch the vacationers show disrespect for what the locals considered sacred. And this was perfectly embodied by a character called Amy. Amy, who seemed to be immensely disconnected to how serious the situation was, only focused on herself as she took photos as though she was at a Disney park. Amy in her blissful ignorance stumbles back to trample some plants on the ground close to the temple. This foolish act of hers triggers a catastrophic event from the locals, causing them to take action. With no other choice they quickly dispatch one of the vacationers, the Grecian, and push the other vacationers into the temple. The locals knew that they could no longer leave, because they had potentially been or have been contaminated by the plants. What happens next is vitally important and set the tone of how seriously the native people take quarantining the temple and protecting its people. There was a moment when the vacationers could have come back from the abyss if they bothered to learn some basic native language. They might have understood that the people were warning them not to get close or touch the plants. The local people did not attack them until they started touching the dangerous fauna. Once that happened, the locals couldn't take any chances. I think this whole sequence was important because it illustrates that the plants, as long as they're not touched, are relatively harmless. But once any part of the body came in contact with the plants, even the cloths a person was wearing, things changed with no other recourse except death and burning of the victim. Okay. Judging from this information, this will help us figure out what this plant is and how it spreads. It's clear to say the plants spread by contact. This is verified by Jeff when examining the hands of Matthias. You see, Matthias found his lost brother covered by vines at the top of the temple. which emotionally pushes Matthias to start tearing at the plants to try to uncover his brother's body. But unfortunately for Matthias, the results was, as Jeff says to Matthias, he had some sort of allergic reaction from touching the plants, showing that Matthias was now contaminated by the plants. We also can deduct that the plants don't spread by air, because of how close the locals get to the temple, and plus if the spores did spread in that matter, they would have easily spread into the surrounding areas by now, especially at the top of the temple where wind conditions would be ideal. Next, we can see from a number of scenes that these plants are not passive hunters but active predators that hunt, stalk, ambush, and lay traps for their prey. This is seen when Matthias is hunted by the plants because of his weakened condition. It's truly amazing to see how fast these plants pounce on their prey, especially when they're in a state that they can't get away. These plants have mastered the skill of ambushing and baiting their prey. We see this when the entire group is fooled by the plant's imitation of a cell phone ringtone. The fake ringtone lures Amy and Stacy down into the temple's darkened corridors, only to be ambushed by the plants, who set a trap for them where they will be infected by the plants and ultimately eaten alive. So now I bring this to the main question. What are the plants? Well, the main clue and the ultimate answer starts with what Eric said to Stacy after seeing her white tank top covered in spores. He said it looks like the spores have found that ideal condition to grow. What he says fits, because spores are very specific genealogically when it comes to a certain type of plant. A spore is a reproductive cell capable of developing into a new individual without fusion with another reproductive cell. Spores thus differ from gametes, which are reproductive cells that must fuse in pairs in order to give rise to a new individual. Spores are agents of asexual reproduction. Spores are produced by bacteria, fungi, algae, and plants. Before I go on, I want to reiterate how dangerous these plants are, because I don't think we quite understand how bad things can get if these plants started to spread into the wider world. So for us to get a deeper understanding, we have to understand the dangers of the spores. And why did the locals act so aggressively towards anyone who came in contact with it, even their own children? Well, that's because they knew something that the vacationers did not. The spores control the mind. This is the vine's real dark, menacing secret. This is seen when Stacy would come completely unhinged and hyper-aggressive. She also seemed to have some sort of psychological connection to the plants. How deep is this mind control? We can only guess. But from how the locals behave when it comes to containing the nightmarish plants, we can only imagine that it is far more insidious than what we can imagine. It may seem funny from the surface perspective that spores can affect the mind, but in reality it is all but true. One spores-based species that does this is the mucormycosis. It often affects the skin, and most importantly the brain. So now that we know spores can come from certain plants, which species could have given rise to these bloodthirsty voracious plants that we come to know in this movie? To find that out, we're going to have to examine spores again. Spores are most conspicuous in the non-seed-bearing plants, including liverworts, hornworts, mosses, and ferns. In these lower plants, as in fungi, the spores function much like seeds. In general, the parent plant sheds the spores locally. The spore-generating organs are frequently located on the undersides of leaves. Now that we have a list of possible plants that could have produced these monstrosities, I believe that this list helps us narrow down our choices to one particular plant. I believe these plants are a subspecies or mutation of the hornwort. The hornwort, also called horned liverwort, any of about 300 species of small non-vascular plants. Hornworts usually grow on damp soils or on rocks in tropical and warm temperate regions. The largest genus, Anthoceros, has a worldwide distribution. Dendroceros and Megaceros are mainly tropical genera. Hornworts have an ancient lineage and are thought to be some of the earliest plants to have evolved on land. Everything lines up with this scenario, because hornworts are an ancient plant species dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Things only get better from here, because the hornworts are a non-vascular plant which live both on land and in water. This explains why the plant is at home growing in the human body, considering the body is mostly water, and how it could feed on the nutrients in the blood. Hornworts are also a fast-growing plant. Estimated growing speed is about 1 to 4 inches, 3 to 10 centimeters per week. Another factor that points to hornworts as possible explanation behind the temple's plants is the hornworts is great at sucking up ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites, but also the hornwort doesn't need light to grow, so it even grows well in a dark. From that last clue, I believe, in my humble opinion, that the temple plants that we see ravaging anyone who makes contact with it is a subspecies of the hornworts. To me, it explains almost every aspect of what these plants are and how they behave. First, the plants is incredibly fast growing. Next, the plant is spore-based as its reproduction method. Next, the main factors is that hornwort doesn't need light to grow, so it's perfectly fine within the dark realms of the temple. And last, the hornwort's plant is aquatic and land-based species, which shows why it is fine at reproducing inside the human body, especially since the body is made of water. In conclusion, I believe the plants we see terrorizing the locals at the temple are mutation of the hornwort plant. It fits the scenario, and plus most plant species can't do half the things of what hornworts can do. So guys, leave your comments below and tell me what you think about the temple plants and their connection to this ancient plant called hornwort. Leave your comments below, and as always, thank you for taking the time to watch this video.